The jungle pressed in from every side, its canopy so dense that daylight only slipped through in fractured beams. A squad of U.S. Marines moved single file along a narrow, mud-churned trail, their boots sinking deep into wet soil. Helmet cams caught every sway of vines, every slick root threatening to trip a man under full gear. Insects swarmed around their faces, the constant buzz barely audible over the labored breath in their comms. Somewhere ahead, beyond the tangle of green and shadow, was the insurgent camp holding the hostages. In the forward operating base's command center, the feed played across 3 monitors. The largest screen carried the live composite from the helmet cams. A comms tech sat forward in his chair, one hand hovering over a keyboard, the other resting lightly near the headset controls, as if a touch could will the connection to stay strong. Around him, officers studied maps spread across a table, their eyes flicking between the coordinates and the flickering images on screen. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and machine oil. In the jungle, a Marine's cam tilted toward the ground for a moment, showing the slick imprint of a boot in fresh mud, edges still sharp. The squad leader whispered a hand signal. Somewhere in the background, a bird call cut off mid-note. Muzzle brakes shifted slightly as rifles came up. No one spoke. The only sound was the deepening hiss of rain beginning to fall through the canopy. Without warning, the feed erupted in movement. Muzzle flashes burst from the undergrowth ahead and to the right. The first shots cracked loud in the confined space, answered by controlled return fire. One cam jolted sharply, the view rolling into a close-up of churned earth as its owner went down. The sound was a mix of shouts, overlapping radio calls, and the short bursts of automatic fire echoing strangely in the wet air. Back in the command center, one officer leaned over the comms tech's shoulder and asked for a grid update. The tech shook his head, eyes still locked on the static-punctuated images. The overlay showed the squad boxed in, contact points closing from 2 sides. Another cam caught a glimpse of an RPG flash before the blast threw the image sideways, half the view now streaked with smoke and splintered leaves. A voice on the net shouted for covering fire, followed by a fractured transmission in which half the words dropped out. The comms tech adjusted the channel, but the signal was breaking apart, fragments of gunfire and breathless commands fading in and out. On the far left monitor, a helmet cam caught the burning wreckage of an overturned transport at the edge of the trail. Dark smoke climbed into the canopy, curling in the rain. One Marine's cam turned sharply, revealing a man lying face down in the mud, a hand-drawn map tucked into the vest on his back, its edge visible through torn fabric. A streak of dark red cut across it. The cam jerked again, swinging back toward the sound of more incoming fire. The image shook as its wearer dragged a wounded comrade toward a fallen log. In the command center, the operations lead asked how many were still mobile. No answer came. The main feed froze for half a second, then resumed in bursts, faces in the half-light, eyes wide but focused, weapons firing toward unseen shapes. A comms officer muttered under his breath, not meant for anyone to hear, that the squad would never make it out. The rain was heavier now, drumming against leaves and helmets alike. A cam panned just long enough to show a blood-stained photograph pressed against the inside of a pouch flap, a woman and child smiling against a summer sky. The camera jolted once more. Then the screen went black, leaving only the comms display, its channel light blinking against a field of static. In the silence that followed, no one moved. The hangar lights cast long, pale beams across the concrete floor, catching on the edges of flight cases and weapon racks. The Navy SEALs moved through their gear checks with quiet precision, each man focused on his task, each motion practiced 100 times over. Weapons were broken down, inspected, and reassembled. Magazines were stacked in neat rows on a table before disappearing into pouches. The metallic tang of aircraft fuel hung in the air, mixing with the faint scent of oil from freshly serviced rifles. Captain Aaron Wallace stood near the open side of the hangar, the folded hand-drawn map from the Marines' failed mission tucked into her thigh pocket. She didn't unfold it. Her gloved hands rested lightly on the edge of a workbench as she scanned the printed insertion chart. In the early light, seeping through the hangar's open doors, her helmet visor caught a flash of gold before she lowered it again. Eyes back on the paper. A generator hummed steadily at the far wall, vibrating through the floor in a low, constant thrum. Outside, the first hints of jungle humidity seeped into the cool air, softening the edges of the fuel smell. Erin shifted her stance, feeling the weight of her flight gear settle into familiar places. Across the bay, two SEALs hauled a crate toward the waiting Blackhawk, boots striking in sync against the concrete. Near the comms table, a young technician frowned at the handheld encrypted radio, tapping it lightly with the back of his finger. A burst of static crackled through the speaker before settling into a faint hum. He glanced toward a superior officer and mentioned the glitch. The officer gave a curt nod without looking up from his clipboard. "It's fine. Keep moving." The tech hesitated, then returned to packing the set into its case. Erin caught the exchange but said nothing. She adjusted the strap on her survival pack and moved toward the aircraft, passing rows of gear laid out for final checks. A SEAL at the edge of the group was etching a small mark into the stock of his rifle, the motion quick and deliberate, before he slid it back into his sling. No one asked about it, and he didn't explain. The Blackhawk loomed in the center of the bay, its rotor blades angled slightly toward the open air, casting faint shadows over the tarmac outside. Crew chiefs moved along its side, checking panels and running hands along cables. Erin stepped up into the cabin, taking in the smell of canvas, metal, and the faint trace of hydraulic fluid. She secured her harness with a practiced pull, then glanced out at the rest of the team still loading their gear. The final call came over the internal net, flat and without ceremony. All personnel in. The last of the crates were locked down, doors swung shut, and the sound in the hangar shifted as engines began to spool. The low whine climbed steadily, filling the space with vibration. Erin's hand rested briefly over the pocket holding the folded map before gripping the edge of her seat. The blades began to turn overhead, each rotation faster than the last, and the morning light on the horizon grew sharper. The inevitability of what waited in the jungle pressed in as the Blackhawk eased forward toward the open sky. The first light of dawn spilled thin and pale across the Central African canopy, the jungle below still half shrouded in mist. From her seat in the cockpit, Captain Erin Wallace kept her eyes moving between the horizon and her instruments. The Blackhawk held steady in a staggered formation behind the lead SEAL transport, both helicopters flying low enough that the scent of wet foliage mixed with the sharp tang of aircraft fuel seeped into the cabin. The rotor wash pushed the fog into swirling ribbons, breaking it into fractured beams where the rising sun slipped through gaps in the tree line. Inside the cabin behind her, the SEALs sat in silence, weapons angled across their knees, their faces unreadable under low helmets. It was the kind of flight Erin had made dozens of times. Her hands were light on the cyclic, her feet steady on the pedals, small corrections keeping them in line with the lead bird. The air was dense and damp, the temperature climbing even in the early hour. She felt the folded marine map pressing lightly against her thigh with each shift in her seat, a constant reminder of why they were here. The comms line was quiet apart from the faint hiss of static, an intermittent glitch that had followed them since takeoff. The first warning came not as sound but as a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision, a sudden streak rising from the green below. Before she could call it, the missile slammed into the lead helicopter in a burst of fire and debris. The explosion lit the fog in a bright orange bloom, the shockwave rattling through her own airframe. Fragments of metal and shattered rotor blades spun into the canopy. Erin banked instinctively, shoving the collective forward to gain speed and break line of sight. A second missile launched from the trees, its smoke trail cutting upward at a brutal angle. The Blackhawk shuddered as it struck near the rear, alarms blaring in her headset. Red warning lights flared across the panel. She felt the tail rotor yaw hard, the nose dipping as she fought to keep the aircraft level. In the back, The seals tightened their harnesses without a word. One reached over to grip the shoulder of the man beside him, steadying them both against the violent shake. Another leaned in toward the open door, scanning the tree line with his rifle, though there was no clear target in the blur of passing green. Erin's voice was even as she called out, "Hold on," and pulled into a shallow descent, aiming for a break in the canopy where a darker shadow suggested a ravine. Hydraulic pressure was dropping fast. She adjusted trim and power, coaxing every second of controlled flight from the damaged bird. The smell of burning insulation began to seep into the cabin, sharp and bitter. The treetops broke around them as she angled into the gap. The descent was steep, the rotors clipping at vines and thin branches. The landing was more impact than touch metal screamed. The skids caught uneven ground, and the helicopter lurched onto its side before settling in a jarring halt. For a heartbeat, there was only the ticking sound of cooling metal. Then the crew door was shoved open from inside. Seals spilled into the vine-choked ravine, dragging gear and the wounded with them. Erin unbuckled, her visor cracked down one side and reflecting a sliver of lingering firelight from the wreck. She stepped out into ankle-deep mud, the folded marine map still secure in her pocket. Behind them, the Blackhawk smoldered, smoke curling into the canopy until it blended with the low morning mist. A rifle with a carved stock lay half buried near the skid, its personal mark still visible through the grime. From somewhere beyond the ravine's lip came the faint, unmistakable sound of voices moving through the jungle, closing in. The ravine held the heat like a sealed chamber, the air thick and damp enough to taste. Smoke from the Blackhawk drifted in slow, curling threads above the wreckage, its scent mingling with burning aviation fuel and the sharper odor of scorched metal. The vines that had torn against the rotors now hung limp and frayed, brushing against the mud where Erin Wallace stood, one gloved hand steadying herself against the fuselage's buckled frame. Her right shoulder throbbed from the impact, but she pushed the pain aside and began counting heads. 5 seals were upright and moving, weapons in hand. 2 more lay on the ground, their breathing shallow, one with a leg twisted unnaturally beneath him, the other pale with a dark bloom spreading across his side. Erin's eyes swept the perimeter, noting the steep, root-tangled walls of the ravine, and the way the canopy above trapped the humidity. Somewhere beyond, the low thrum of insects was returning, a sign that the immediate chaos had passed, but not for long. "Get them under cover," she said, already moving toward the nearest of the wounded. Her voice was clipped, the tone of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. The able-bodied seals dragged the injured toward a patch of ferns tucked against a wall of earth, out of direct sight from above. From the far side of the wreck, one of the men emerged with a rifle stock in his hand, the rest of the weapon gone. The wood was worn smooth, carved with a small, deliberate mark. Erin recognized it immediately. She had seen the same symbol etched into gear, recovered from the Marine's failed mission. The seal passed it to her without a word, and she slid it into her pack alongside the folded Marine map, now dirt-stained from the crash. They moved quickly through the wreckage, stripping ammunition, med kits, and anything usable from those who would not be leaving the ravine. No one spoke about the dead. The only sound was the shifting of gear, the rustle of fabric, and the faint, intermittent spark from a cracked comms unit lying in the mud, its light blinking weakly before fading to black again. Erin checked her watch, then pointed to a narrow gap between 2 thick-rooted trees. "That's our way out," she said. She crouched beside one of the wounded, tightening a tourniquet with steady hands, then gestured for 2 seals to take positions flanking the opening. Leadership came in movement, one task to the next. No pause, no unnecessary words. The heat pressed harder, beading sweat along her hairline beneath the helmet. In the quiet, a sharp sound carried from above a short, muffled call in a language not their own. Another followed, closer this time, the rhythm of boots sliding on damp soil. The insect noise faltered again, just slightly, enough for every man in the ravine to hear it. Erin straightened, checking the fit of her rifle's sling. "They're sweeping this way," she said quietly. The SEALs adjusted their grips, eyes fixed on the narrow escape route. Somewhere beyond the smoke and vines, the patrol was closing in. The first sign came as a faint rustle above the ravine, branches swaying against the natural rhythm of the breeze. Erin froze where she crouched beside one of the wounded, eyes lifting toward the lip of the slope. The sound came again, heavier this time, followed by the dull clink of metal on metal. Voices carried down in short, clipped bursts of a language she didn't speak, but the tone was unmistakable orders being given. She signaled with 2 fingers, and the nearest SEAL shifted to a firing position behind a jut of rock. Another tightened his grip on a rifle with a carved stock, the mark just visible where his gloved hand didn't cover it. The heat in the ravine seemed to grow heavier, every breath thick with the smell of smoke and damp earth. The first insurgent appeared through the vines, a dark silhouette framed by the light filtering down from above. Erin's rifle came up as another stepped into view, and then the ravine erupted with fire. The sharp crack of rifles was deafening in the enclosed space, echoing back from the walls. She fired in controlled bursts, keeping her eyes on the opening, then called over her shoulder for movement. 2 SEALs lifted the wounded between them, stepping over twisted roots and slick mud as they pushed toward the narrow gap Erin had marked earlier. She shifted her fire to cover their path, her boots sinking deep into the wet ground with every step backward. A round sparked against a rock near her head, throwing shards of stone against her visor. The oppressive humidity clung to everything, gear straps biting into shoulders, damp fabric dragging at limbs. Erin's breath came steady, each inhalation carrying the mix of burning fuel and crushed vegetation. The team moved in short bursts, trading fire, advancing a few meters out, stopping to return fire again. Near the gap, the cracked comms unit on one SEAL's vest hissed to life. Static burst into the air, jagged and uneven, before a string of coordinates cut through in a mechanical voice. Erin caught the numbers instantly. They matched a mark on the Marine's hand-drawn map. Her decision was immediate. The extraction point they'd been given was farther out and likely compromised. This route, unknown to their planners, might offer concealment and a way to flank their hunters. "Change of course," she ordered, her voice calm but firm. She moved to the lead, slinging her rifle across her chest and pulling the dirt-smeared map from her pocket just long enough to confirm the path. The paper was creased and damp, the red marks faint, but legible. They pushed into the gap, leaves and branches snapping against their gear. The jungle swallowed them quickly, the light dimming under thicker canopy. Behind them, the gunfire slowed, replaced by the shouts of insurgents realizing their quarry had slipped away. Erin set a brisk but steady pace, scanning constantly for the landmarks she'd memorized. The carved rifle stock stayed in the rear guard's grip, its mark now as much a silent promise as an identifier. The team moved deeper into the undergrowth, the smell of the burning wreck fading with each step. The voices behind them grew fainter, but never fully disappeared, lingering like the knowledge that the chase was far from over. The map, now their only guide, rustled softly in Erin's pocket as they vanished into the green. The jungle closed in tighter the farther they moved from the crash site, the air heavy with moisture that clung to skin and gear alike. Erin moved at the point, her eyes scanning the ground as much as the shifting shadows ahead. Each step was deliberate, avoiding the snap of twigs or the drag of boots through loose leaves. The dirt-smeared marine map rode in her pocket, its creases worn soft from repeated folding, each mark now committed to memory. They rationed their water with quiet discipline, each man taking only a mouthful before passing the canteen on. The liquid was warm, metallic, but it kept their focus sharp. At a brief halt, one SEAL rolled up a pant leg to pull a leech from his calf, dropping it silently into the undergrowth before tightening his boot again. Metal buckles were wrapped with strips of cloth to muffle any noise. Even the adjustment of rifle slings was done slowly, the movement almost invisible. The jungle spoke in layers, bird calls high in the canopy, the faint rattle of leaves stirred by something more than wind. Erin lifted a hand, signaling a pause. She inhaled, catching the faint, acrid scent of wood smoke from somewhere ahead. It was thin and fading, not a fresh fire, but close enough to be worth following. The night birds continued their calls, a sign the insurgents were not moving in the immediate area. They found the first sign of the hostages along a narrow game trail. A scrap of faded cloth hung from the thorns of a bush, torn roughly and caught in two places. Erin ran her fingers over it, noting the frayed edges before tucking it into her pocket. A few paces farther, the ground bore shallow drag marks through the damp soil. The pattern uneven, as if a weight had been shifted from one side to the other. A discarded water container lay on its side near a tangle of roots, its cap missing. Mud and small leaves clung to its surface, but it was not yet overtaken by ants or rot. Erin crouched, eyes following the faint depressions in the earth leading away from it. The path aligned with a bearing she had traced on the map earlier. Behind her, one of the seals paused to kneel, pulling his rifle into his lap. With a short, practiced motion, he carved a fresh mark into the stock beside the older ones. The sound of the blade on wood was faint, almost swallowed by the ambient noise, but the meaning was understood by all. It was both a personal record and a silent affirmation of where they were headed. They moved on, weaving between moss-covered trunks and over fallen branches slick with lichen. The ground began to show more signs: compressed leaves, the faint shine of mud where a foot had slid. The wood smoke smell grew stronger, mixing now with the faint scent of cooked rice. Erin kept her eyes forward, adjusting their path slightly to keep the wind in their favor. When they halted again, the trail ahead was clear enough for even the rear guard to see. They were closing the gap, but the stillness in the air warned her that with each step forward, the risk of being seen or heard was rising. The jungle might be guiding them, but it could turn on them just as quickly. The jungle at night was a wall of sound. Insects droned in a constant high note, broken only by the occasional snap of something moving through the undergrowth far beyond their perimeter. The heat had not lessened with the darkness. It clung to skin and gear, a damp weight pressing in on every breath. The team lay low in a small hollow beneath overlapping branches, their shapes broken by foliage and shadow. Erin sat near the center, the dirt-stained marine map folded in her pocket, her attention fixed on the handheld comms unit resting on her knee. Its faint red glow lit the edges of her gloves. Across from her, the SEAL communications tech adjusted his own headset, slowly turning the dial to sweep the shortwave spectrum. The others stayed still, rifles angled toward the dark, their breathing steady but quiet. The first fragment came as a burst of static, sharper than the background hiss. Erin leaned closer. Another burst followed, then a clear, deliberate voice speaking English. The tone was clipped, professional, the words coming in measured intervals as though reading from a prepared message. The tech froze, eyes narrowing as his fingers stilled on the controls. "That's not insurgent traffic," he said under his breath. His gaze flicked to her before he began tapping in a quick series of adjustments. The transmission steadied, and with it came an identifier, an encryption pattern embedded in the signal. Erin recognized the rhythm of it even before he said it aloud. "It's ours," he whispered. "Command-level authentication." He swallowed before adding, "It's addressed to their leadership." The jungle's noise seemed to recede, leaving only the faint crackle of the signal and the steady pulse of the red light on the comms unit. Erin felt her jaw tighten. There was no question now. Someone high enough to sign off on this encryption had handed them over. The Marines before them had been caught the same way. She glanced around the circle. The men watching her didn't ask for confirmation, they read it in her expression. In the dim light, the rearguard's rifle lay across his lap, the carved mark on its stock catching a shadowed edge. No one spoke. The truth had settled over them in full, and there was no taking it back. Erin reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the folded map. It felt heavier now, its creases damp from the heat. She slid it back into place with deliberate care. The mission to reach the hostages hadn't changed, but its weight had doubled. They weren't just fighting to pull people out, they were carrying proof of a betrayal that someone in their own chain of command would do anything to bury. The river was cold even in the pre-dawn heat, the current tugging at their legs as they moved in a slow, silent line. Water reached their waists, soaking gear straps and pulling at fatigues with every step. Each SEAL kept his weapon above the surface, suppressor angled forward, the dark metal beating with mist. Erin was at the front, her eyes locked on the faint break in the tree line where the camp's perimeter began. The jungle was waking muted bird calls, the distant crack of a branch, but the river's slow rush muffled their passage. The bank rose ahead, slick with mud and shadowed by overhanging roots. Erin climbed first, one hand gripping a low branch as her boots found solid ground. The SEALs followed without a word, forming up in pairs as they moved into position. The camp's outline took shape, through the trees, a rough bamboo enclosure at its center, guarded by 2 men on the near side and another walking the far corner. Lantern light flickered weakly between the slats. A tap on her shoulder signaled readiness. Erin raised 2 fingers, then swept them forward. The first suppressor report was a muted cough, the guard dropping soundlessly into the mud. A second followed, the far sentry crumpling into the shadows. The team moved in sync, gliding between structures, each man clearing his sector before signaling the next to move. The breach came fast. 2 SEALs cut through the bamboo lashings at the rear of the enclosure, pulling the slats just wide enough for a figure to slip through. Inside, 3 civilians huddled together, their faces pale but alert, and a 4th figure lay against the far wall, a Marine. His uniform dark with dried blood, one arm bound in a rough sling. Erin stepped in, helping him to his feet. His grip was weak but determined. While the others guided the hostages toward the perimeter, Erin scanned the nearest hut for anything worth taking. The air inside was stale, heavy with the smell of oil and damp wood. Stacked against one wall were wooden crates, their stenciled markings barely visible in the low light. She stepped closer, brushing away a layer of dust. The logo was unmistakable, a private military contractor she knew had been working under U.S. contracts. Seeing it here, in insurgent territory, was like a punch to the chest. She snapped 2 quick photos on her wrist cam before backing out, the weight of what she'd found adding a new edge to the mission. Outside, the perimeter guards were down, and the rest of the camp was beginning to stir. A muffled shout carried from the far side. Erin gestured sharply, and the SEALs moved the hostages into a staggered file, flanking them with rifles up. The Marine map in her pocket was now marked with the path they had taken, each turn etched into her mind as clearly as on the paper. They slipped back toward the river, using the same shadowed routes they had come in on. The carved stocks of the SEALs' rifles caught faint glints from the dim lantern light as they passed the camp's edge, silent signatures left unspoken. By the time the first insurgent voice shouted in alarm, they were already halfway to the water. The cold of the river bit again as they stepped into it, hostages moving between armed escorts, every eye scanning the dark banks. Erin kept her focus forward, feeling the current pull them back toward their planned exfil point. Relief at the rescue pressed at the edges of her thoughts. But the knowledge of those crates, what they proved, kept her grip tight on the rifle. The jungle ahead offered no guarantee of safety. Only another stretch of shadow they had to cross before the sun came up. Tracer fire tore through the pre-dawn haze, bright arcs cutting across the open ground as the first rounds cracked into tree trunks around them. Bark splintered, the fragments stinging exposed skin. Erin dropped into a crouch behind a fallen tree, its trunk wide enough to shelter 3 of them. The hostages scrambled into cover, the wounded Marine nearly collapsing as a SEAL dragged him in. Shouts in multiple languages carried from the ridge above, the voices tightening into the rhythm of men laying down coordinated fire. Erin keyed her radio with one hand while keeping her rifle steady in the other. Request immediate extraction. Coordinates marked. Her words were clipped, precise. The reply came seconds later, the voice on the other end flat and cold, telling her the zone was too hot and clearance denied. The channel clicked dead before she could respond. She didn't waste the breath to argue. Her eyes swept the ground between them and the tree line, noting the angles of fire and the gaps between bursts. "On me," she said, already moving. Two SEALs laid down suppressive fire. Controlled bursts angled toward the ridge, while the rest pushed the hostages toward a cluster of low buildings ahead. The Marine map was tucked tight into her vest, its weight against her chest an anchor as they moved. They broke into the first yard just as another volley slammed into the dirt behind them. The smell of smoke was thicker here, carrying the acrid edge of burning thatch. Around the corner of a collapsed wall, an old flatbed truck sat idling, its windshield crazed with a spiderweb of cracks. Erin was moving before anyone else, yanking the door open and checking the ignition. Keys were in. She shouted for the wounded and civilians to load up, her tone sharp enough to cut through the gunfire. The SEALs boosted the hostages into the bed, weapons still up, their eyes scanning for movement. Spent casings rolled underfoot, catching the first light as the sun began to edge over the horizon. Erin slid behind the wheel, one hand on the gear shift, the other gripping the wheel hard enough for her knuckles to whiten. The truck lurched forward, tires spitting gravel, and they were moving. They tore through the edge of the burning village, the heat pressing against them in waves. A rooster darted from under a fence as a sidewall collapsed inward, sending a cloud of ash into the air. Bullets chased them down the main track, hitting the side panels with sharp metallic pings. Erin kept the wheel steady, her eyes locked on the narrow gap ahead where the road curved toward higher ground. The truck's suspension groaned as they climbed, every bump jarring the wounded in the bed. One SEAL braced himself against the cab, returning fire at shapes flickering in the smoke behind them. The air thinned slightly as they crested the last rise. Erin gunned the engine, pushing through the final stretch until the trees broke open into the cliffside clearing. She braked hard, the truck skidding slightly on the loose dirt. Enemy fire was still echoing in the distance, but for the first time in hours, there was space around them to breathe. The clearing was a churn of dust and smoke, the air sharp with the smell of gunpowder. Muzzle flashes split the dim light as the SEALs held the tree line, each burst illuminating faces streaked with sweat and grit. Erin moved between positions, checking angles, counting the rhythm of incoming fire. The wind shifted, carrying the low thump of rotor blades from somewhere beyond the ridge. It grew louder, whipping the smoke into torn streamers as the unmarked helicopter crested the tree line. Its paint was flat and featureless, its silhouette clean of any national markings. The side door slid open before it had fully settled into a hover, the pilot's voice cutting through the noise. "Wallace, get aboard. Bring the evidence." Erin's eyes met his for only a moment before she turned to the SEAL commander. She pulled the dirt-stained Marine map from her vest, folding it once more before pressing it into his hand. The comms recorder came next, its casing scratched but intact, followed by the small wrist cam holding images of the contractor-marked crates. "Get these where they need to go," she said. Her tone was even, almost quiet, but the weight in it was impossible to miss. Rounds cracked through the brush at the edge of the clearing, snapping leaves from branches. The SEALs shifted their fire to cover the hostages as they were moved toward the helicopter. One of the civilians stumbled, and Erin was there, steadying her with a hand before passing her to the next man in line. The helicopter's rotor wash flattened the grass and sent shell casings skittering over the dirt, their metallic clinks drowned in the engine's roar. Erin's sidearm rested in her palm, the grip marked with the small carving she'd cut herself years ago. She adjusted it once, checking the slide, then let her hand drop to her side. The last of the survivors climbed aboard. The SEAL commander gave her a final look, half question, half understanding before stepping into the cabin. Erin stepped back, well clear of the rotor arc, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The helicopter lifted, rising above the trees in a cloud of dust and debris. As the sound began to fade, she turned toward the deeper shadows at the jungle's edge. The clearing was still alive with movement, the SEALs' firing positions now empty, the ground littered with spent casings cooling in the grass. She moved without hurry, slipping into the green where the light fractured into narrow beams. For a moment, the last glow of the setting moon caught on the carved grip of her sidearm. Then the canopy closed above her, swallowing the light, and she was gone. Behind her, the thump of the helicopter grew distant, carrying its cargo of lives and truth toward a place she might never see.